Welcome to the Veritas Podcast, the weekly show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church. All right, after a week off due to my illness, we're back. This is the Veritas Podcast. My name is Robert Kastman. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Robert Sisko. This is the podcast that studies the papal writing from the Catholic Church. We've been currently working on Pascendi. We can be found at veritaspodcast.blogspot.com, as well as Gloria TV and YouTube. In the last episode, we covered paragraph 12 of Pascendi. Pope Pius wrote about the modernists' view of dogma. Modernists like to reinterpret dogma to fit their current behavior. Because everything is relative to the modernists, they therefore have no objective truth to base their dogma on. This is going to flow nicely into this current discussion we're going to have in this episode. In paragraph 13, Pius continues his discussion and looks at how the modernists defend their relativism by stating that dogma can evolve and therefore change. Change is not stability. Modernists like to talk about the living church. When we hear living from modernists, we should be cautious because it is usually code for change. We never hear modernists talk about how much they love the dogma of the church. They praise the tertiary things of the church, because those they can legitimately change. But modernists are not satisfied with the change of the tertiary things or these secondary things, these things on the outside. They want everything to change and to continue to change because they see themselves as being ahead of their time as modernists, as progressives. And they don't call themselves modernists usually. That's the term that Pius is using and Rob and I are using. But they look at themselves as progressive because what they think they're doing is a good. They love novelty as if it were a dogma in itself. They essentially have more in common with Luther than Peter. Concluding paragraph 13, Pius writes, quote, "In this way, with consummate audacity, they criticize the Church as having strayed from the true path by failing to distinguish between the religious and moral sense of formulas and their surface meaning, and by clinging vainly and tenaciously to meaningless formulas, while religion itself is allowed to go to ruin. Blind they are, and leaders of the blind, puffed up with the proud name of science. They have reached that pitch of folly at which they pervert the eternal concept of truth and the true meaning of religion, and introduce in a new system in which they are seen to be under the sway of a blind and unchecked passion for novelty, thinking not at all of finding some solid foundation of truth, but despising the holy and apostolic traditions, they embrace other and vain, futile, uncertain doctrines, unapproved by the Church, on which, in the height of their vanity, they think that they can base and maintain truth itself." End of quote. Now, Rob, let me bring you into this discussion here. I'll hand it off to you. Modernists hate dogma and hate being reminded of the dogma of the Church. Whenever you say, well, the Church is actually against this, if the Church teaches that, they don't really like that. They kind of freak out like they're allergic to it. They resort to name-calling, and they say that we need to show more love, forgiveness, and compassion. And this happens to me regularly if I just state the facts of a dogma of the teaching of the Church. Modernists want dogma to evolve. Pius is talking about that. They want the dogma to change as they feel it fit. But how is this, Rob, different than the legitimate development of our understanding of a dogma? And in your explanation, can you give an example of development of a specific dogma versus the evolution or the change of a dogma?
Yeah, with true development of doctrine, there's never going to be a change in the meaning of what was believed previously. That's the important point. With evolution of doctrine, there's a change in the meaning. With evolution of doctrine, the old doctrine is rejected and replaced with something new, with a new teaching. And true development of doctrine, it can take place in one of two or maybe three different ways. Either the doctrine can be more clearly expressed, so it can develop that way in a more clear expression of the meaning, or else a teaching, something that was always believed implicitly, can then be taught explicitly. Okay? Now, regarding development of doctrine, understood in the sense that what has always been taught by the church is more clearly expressed over time. An example of this we can see in the teaching of the Eucharist. And we can begin with the words of our Lord as found in the Bible. At the Last Supper, Jesus held up what appeared to be bread and wine, or what appeared to be bread, and said, "This is my body." And then he held up what appeared to be a chalice containing wine, and he said, "This is my blood of the New Testament, which shall be shed for many unto the remission of sins." So here we see at the Last Supper, Jesus holding up what appears to the senses to be bread and wine, yet saying that this bread, what appears to be bread and appears to be wine, is actually his body and blood. Okay? Now, if we go a little forward to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, St. Paul said, "The chalice of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? And the bread which we break, is it not the partaking of the body of the Lord?" That's from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 16. But here again we see St. Paul saying that what appears to be wine is the blood of Christ, and what appears to be bread is the body of Christ. If we fast forward to the 4th century, to the writings of Cyril of Jerusalem in about the year 350, he taught the same thing, but he taught it with a little more clarity. He said this, Cyril of Jerusalem in the year 350, he said, quote, "What appears to be bread is not bread, but Christ's body. And what appears to be wine is not wine, but Christ's blood." Cyril of Jerusalem is a more clear expression of the same truth, but notice, there's not a change in meaning. It's the same truth. He just says it a little bit different, but it's the same underlying meaning. Then, if we move ahead to the 13th century, we find St. Thomas explaining the teaching of the Eucharist by distinguishing between the substance and the accidents. Using the Metaphysics of Aristotle, he taught that the substance of the bread changes into the body of Christ at the consecration, while the accidents or the appearances remain the same. By distinguishing between the substance and the accidents, St. Thomas, he didn't change what Jesus taught, but only explained how what he taught was true. And the teaching of St. Thomas did not in any way depart from the meaning of what Jesus taught, or what St. Paul taught, or what Cyril of Jerusalem taught. It was just a more clear way of expressing so that we can more clearly understand how this teaching is true, or to understand this teaching. So it's a development in the understanding. And the terminology of St. Thomas, it was later used by the Council of Trent in its teaching on the Eucharist. So the Church itself incorporated the terminology of St. Thomas in its official teaching on the Eucharist. But what this shows is that over the years there's been no change in the meaning of the doctrine. That's the important point. Only greater clarity in explaining what has always been taught. So the development in this sense consists just in a more clear way of explaining the particular doctrine. So it's a development in explanation. So that's one way. Now, another way doctrine can develop is when a teaching that has always been believed implicitly is taught explicitly. All right? Now, example, if I was to ask you how many fingers and toes Jesus had, you'd say he has 10 fingers and toes. Now, this has never been defined by the Church, never even been discussed by the Church as far as I know. We just believe this implicitly since Jesus was a perfect man, and it belongs to the perfection of man to have 10 fingers and 10 toes. Before I just raise this question, raise this point, unless you thought about this in the past, you would have implicitly believed Jesus had 10 fingers and 10 toes. And if the Church ever defines this as a doctrine, which isn't likely, but if it ever does define that as a doctrine, then this teaching, which we believed implicitly, will then be required to believe it explicitly. So that's kind of how the implicit, explicit work. Things that have always been believed, but you hadn't really thought about in detail, that's been believed implicitly. But it may come a time when the church defines that particular point, then it must be believed explicitly. And usually teachings that have been believed implicitly are then defined explicitly when a heresy arises that calls that particular point into question. An example of this, there's many examples of this, but one example is the teaching that Christ had two wills, a human will and a divine will. That was always believed implicitly since Christ was true God and true man, but it wasn't defined explicitly until it was then called into question by the heretics in the early 7th century. But over the centuries, there is an increase in points of doctrine or aspects of doctrine that must be believed explicitly. There's an increase in propositions or teachings proposed by the church that must then be adhered to by faith. This increases over time. So Catholics today, we're actually required to believe explicitly in many more propositions, many more teachings than Catholics in the early centuries who only believed them implicitly. But the result of this type of development is that the deposit of faith, and the deposit of faith, as we've mentioned before, deposit of faith is the body of teachings, the body of doctrines that were passed down from Jesus and the apostles. The deposit of faith over time is understood with more clarity and with more precision. And this reminds me of something that St. Augustine said in answering the question of why God allows evil to exist. St. Augustine said the reason is so that God can draw good out of the evil. That's why God allows evil to exist, so that he can then draw good out of it. And the good that God draws out of the evil of heresy is a greater clarity of truth. And this greater clarity of truth is brought about when the truth is defined by the church and when the error is condemned by the church. It's like a star in a dark sky. The darker the sky, the darker the background, the brighter will be the light that shines. The greater, more clearly we'll see the light. So it's the same when the church condemns an error and then defines the truth. When error is condemned, it's like the sky darkening, the background darkening. And then when the truth is defined, it's like the stars brightening, the brightening of the stars. So you can see how God does bring good out of this evil by more clearly showing forth his truth. Now, this is how one bishop explained the development of doctrine from implicit to explicit. This is what he says. This is a kind of a long quote, but it's a good quote. So this is the development from something believed implicitly to something believed explicitly. And the quote I'm about to read, before this section of the quote, he was talking about during the Old Testament. So he's going to start off with the new part talking about the New Testament. And what he's referring to is the whole span of the New Testament, from the time of Christ to now. That's what he means by the word New Testament in the beginning of the quote. He said this, quote, "In the New Testament, there is an increase in the propositions by the organs of tradition, especially the magisterium, and hence a passage from the implicit to the explicit. There is then a development, not in the articles of the faith, but in the explanation of the truths of the revealed deposit. It is a development like a bud that blossoms, like a bud which opens up very beautifully but remains the same bud. There is an unfolding but without alteration, a displaying of all that which had been contained within from the outset. One calls this homogeneous because there is no mutation. It is the same living species, the same plant. It is a development without mutation. It is the same reality unfolding itself and making explicit all its details, but it is the same reality, unquote. So I like the way he explains it. He explains it like a rose blossoming. You have a rose first, it's kind of closed up, and all the petals are there, but you really can't see them all. Well, over time, it opens up. Well, the same thing with doctrines. Over time, as more points are clarified, it kind of opens up. So in our day, after 2,000 years, there's a the road is completely open. Anything you want to know, the church has probably addressed it, except for the 10 fingers and toes.
And Rob, that's an excellent way to say it, because what's really important, Rob, is that we're now obligated to acknowledge all the petals of that rose, since it's now been open to us. We can no longer say, well, nobody ever told me that because it was there. Now, in 300, 400, 500 AD, most people weren't literate either, and the theologians of their time had not maybe formulated the correct understanding of it. Then they might have had a legitimate excuse. But nowadays, especially now in the Western world with all the technology, the internet, truth is at your fingertips 24 hours a day. And when you see truth, it's obviously there. But what happens to people now is they are not even facing the right direction to know that the petals of that rose are blossomed. And so they're almost willfully against it.
Yeah, another trick of the modernists is they claim to like the fathers of the church. They want to go back to the time of the fathers. Well, why do you think they say that? Do you think they say that because they really like the fathers of the church? The fathers of the church were geocentrists. The fathers of the church believed the world existed for 6,000 years only. Do you think those modernists really like the fathers of the church? Of course not. They claim to want to go back to the fathers so they can then bypass the 1,500 years since the fathers. They want to bypass St. Thomas and all the clarity that we got after the fathers. And they do it by claiming to want to go back to the purity of the fathers. That's just a tactic they use. Now, there's another way that there can be a development of doctrine. And this kind of doctrinal development, it applies to moral doctrines or moral teachings that have a practical application, okay? And this happens when the church applies what it teaches to a new problem or a new situation that has arisen. An example we can use for this is in vitro fertilization. This is something new. It wasn't around 500 years ago. It wasn't even around 50 years ago. When a new moral question such as this arises, the church has to apply what it already knows in order to determine if this new thing is or is not morally acceptable. And this also results in a certain kind of development of doctrine, you could say, in the sense that what the church teaches is expanded to encompass new circumstances, new things that have arisen. But the key point with development of doctrine, to remember, is that there can never be a legitimate development that contradicts what was taught before. You can't say the church used to teach this or that, but today we teach the contrary because the doctrine has developed. You can't say that, but that's exactly what the modernists do and what the modernists say. They reject what was taught in the past and claim the doctrine has developed. I was in a conversation with a Catholic years ago who was arguing with me, trying to defend errors that have been formally condemned by the church. And when I pointed out to him that what he was saying had been formally condemned, and when I cited the particular documents that condemned what he was saying, he just shrugged his shoulders and said, development of doctrine. And when I explained that a reversal in a teaching is not a development of doctrine, but evolution of doctrine, which itself, I told him, had been condemned, it didn't faze him. You could tell that he really wasn't interested in knowing what the church taught. He was just trying to find a way to justify his already held belief, even though it had already been condemned by the church. He was just trying to find a way to justify his belief.
Now, Rob, let me interject as well. You make an excellent point, again, with your example with this man, because this is not necessarily a problem with the assent of the will. I think that a lot of these Catholics and Protestants don't even understand how to believe, much less what to believe. And this is why we spend so much time on the philosophy, the theology, the metaphysics, before we even get into the actual quotes of Pius, for instance, and this series that we're doing, because if you don't understand how to think correctly, then most of these arguments and points don't mean anything anyway, because then you can just say development of doctrine, because he thinks that that's an ace of spade, and you're saying you don't even know what you're saying. Your response, Rob, is you don't even know what you're saying, but he doesn't care to know. He doesn't want truth because true truth is not on his side.
Yes, it's like the implicit and explicit. You'll know the truth, but you'll run across someone who's so far off base, you never could have imagined someone was that far off. So you try to get in their mind to see what they're thinking in order to try to then sort out how they're in error. So that's actually one of the benefits. And now it's not fun talking to these people, but there are some benefits to it if you know the truth. You can then try to get into their mind and see where they're off, and then you can think about it and think of a way then to answer them, which also helps you to understand the faith a little bit better by knowing where they're off and how to answer their particular error.
Right, but just like a modernist, Rob, he had his conclusion before he had reached it. So he wanted certain things to be true. He wanted this development of doctrine because he wanted this new behavior to be accepted, or this new way of thinking to be accepted. So he had that first, his conclusion first, and then he didn't really care how he arrived at that. We've talked about this before in our example about using the map going from one place in Texas to another. They just want to be at their destination. They don't really understand how they get there, even if how they get there is the wrong way. That's modernism. They're so backwards.
Well, actually, what happened is, if you think about how the intellect and the will work together, the intellect considers something, and then the will embraces it. And once the will embraces a proposition, whatever the proposition is, you could be any proposition. Once the will embraces that, the person is usually going to hold on to that teaching. You're usually going to try to defend that particular teaching. So this person had to embrace some errors. His will had adhered to errors. And so he was then not willing to let go of those errors. He needed to find a way to justify how he's able to be in error. And he did so by saying that the development of doctrine has caused the condemned error to no longer be condemned. So the problem is, it's with Protestants or anyone, once they embrace an error, it's hard to get them to free it up. So what you have to do when you argue with someone, you have to try to get them someone who's in error, to move their will to a neutral position. You have to get them to basically be open-minded, is the way to say it, where their will is no longer adhering to that error. You have to get them to move to a more neutral position by questions or different things, and then you try to bring them around to the truth. But once someone's hardened in error, that's why arguing sometimes doesn't work. Because if you're arguing with someone who's in error, he's just going to try to find reasons to justify his error. So you have to start gently by bringing their will to a neutral position, opening them up, and then you bring them around to the truth. Now, it's not easy, but that's the best way to do it.
All right, let's keep going.
Okay. Now, another point is the modernists, they're really tricky. They are tricky and they are slippery. And they're going to use the word, they do it all the time today, they use the term development of doctrine, which is a correct term. Doctrines can develop when you understand that term right. But they use the word development of doctrine when they're engaged in evolution of doctrine. You see, so that's nothing else to keep in mind. When they say development of doctrine, do they really mean development of doctrine, or do they mean evolution of doctrine? And they're almost always going to mean evolution of doctrine. Okay? And what they'll also do They'll also claim that, that doctrine changed due to a deeper understanding. So it's our deeper understanding of this doctrine, which they say is the development, which has caused us to understand it differently today. And it's interesting, they always say deeper understanding, but what's interesting is that was explicitly condemned in the First Vatican Council. I'm going to read 3 quotes here from the First Vatican Council. These are excellent quotes to condemn evolution of doctrine. These are infallible. Quote, "The doctrine of faith which God revealed has not been handed down as a philosophic invention to the human mind to be perfected, but has been entrusted as a divine deposit to the spouse of Christ to be faithfully guarded and infallibly interpreted. Hence also that understanding of its sacred dogmas must be perpetually retained, which Holy Mother Church has once declared, and there must never be a recession from that meaning under the specious name of a deeper understanding," unquote. Next quote from Vatican I. "Therefore, let the understanding, the knowledge, and the wisdom of individuals as of all, of one man as of the whole Church, grow and progress strongly with the passage of the ages and centuries, but let it be solely in its own genus, namely, in the same dogma, with the same sense and the same understanding," unquote. Next quote. "If anyone shall have said that it is possible that to the dogmas declared by the Church a meaning must sometimes be attributed according to the progress of science, different from that which the Church has understood and understands, let him be anathema," unquote. Now, evolution of doctrine, it will manifest itself in one of 3 ways. Okay? Sometimes the person will flat out reject what the Church taught before and claim the teaching no longer applies, like the person I mentioned earlier. The Church used to teach that, but it's developed, it doesn't teach it anymore. Okay? That's one way. But it will also take place where a person will claim to accept the doctrine, but then they'll water it down to such a degree that it becomes a meaningless formula. And that's what Pius XII complained about of some Catholics in his day, that some Catholics in his day were doing with the doctrine, no salvation outside the Catholic Church. He said they were, quote, reducing it to a meaningless formula, unquote. And what would he say if he were alive today? This problem has got far worse. If you listen to a Catholic radio show, you'll hear this all the time. They completely water down that doctrine by focusing exclusively on every possible imaginable exception. Whenever it arises, they immediately go to every exception. They don't affirm the truth. They just go to every exception. And the end result, that the people that are listening are left with the impression that the doctrine is a meaningless formula, like Pius XII said. And another tactic of the modernists, and this is the most devious, is to retain the terminology but infuse into it a completely different meaning. So they keep the phrase, but they change the meaning, and they don't tell you they changed the meaning.
Rob, that's a good place to stop. We'll end there. This is a pretty good episode on the doctrine of how dogma can be properly understood versus the modernists' idea of evolving dogma. So we'll pick it up here next time.